تنسوا الاعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.
Their minds when they see war and want to go back to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward Yam Suf.
When the Israelites left Egypt, the question of where they went is again a difficult question. We know the names of some of the places that they reached on their journey to Mount Sinai, but most of those places cannot be identified today on the ground. We don't find signposts saying 5 miles to such a place or welcome to this place to tell us. So in a few cases, we may find similarities in the names that still exist today to the ancient names and suggest that they're the same places, but it's very hard to prove. And of course, people moving, as the Israelites did from Egypt to Mount Sinai, are not going to leave relics for us to find to, as it were, trace their footsteps. So it's a matter to a large extent of hypothesis which route they took.
Well, if we talk about the story of the Exodus, they were told not to go this way. They were told not to go this way, which was called the way of the Philistines?
Right, or way of the land of the Philistines.
Okay.
Typically, roads in the ancient world were named based on the destination point. So that if you were going from Egypt to Canaan, the destination point would be the name. So the land of the Philistines, of course, is the southern corner of the ancient coast of Canaan. And so this would be that route that the Bible tells us the Israelites did not go on, lest they see war and turn back. We now, thanks to a combination of the geological work that's been done, archaeological work that's been done, we can now shed light on that picture.
The question is, did the Israelites go on this road or not? The answer also impacts whether the miraculous crossing of Yam Suf happened near Egypt at one of the border lakes, or far from Egypt at the Gulf of Aqaba. The Egyptian view has popularized the idea that the crossing happened near Egypt at a shallow lake area. Does the Hebrew text, make that a possibility when you read the Hebrew?
A handful of responses. Number one, the text makes explicit that God told Israel, you're not going to go a northern route along the Mediterranean coast, the way of the Philistines. You're not going to go that way to the Promised Land, even though it was the closest. And the reason it says is so that you will not want to return.
If they would have went up to those lakes up towards the north, they would have been going the very way.
That would have been the very way that God verbally declared, you shall not go this way. And to think that God would have altered his reflections would have gone against his purpose. He didn't want them to be so close to Egypt that they could easily turn around. So wherever we look for the region of the water crossing, we need to recognize it can't be near Egypt because God didn't want them to be so close that they'd want to return. And he says it's not going to be by way of the Philistines because that way is near Egypt.
But those in the Egyptian approach are split about whether they actually went on the northern road or not.
We know that Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 says to the Israelites, it says to Moses, when you leave, do not take the way to the land of the Philistines. Well, we know that the Egyptians had a whole series of forts along that road. It's the equivalent of an interstate highway. Not that it was paved and patrolled and lighted and so forth. I don't mean that. In that it was a major international roadway. By roadway, I mean pathway. There are times, I'm sure, when because of the season, it got clogged with mud and roots and growth and so forth. But it's a major transportation artery.
So they weren't going to go north?
Well, I'm assuming that this prohibition was necessary.
Mm-hmm.
13 verse 17. So when you leave, do not take that road. All right, I think the reason for the prohibition, we have to deduce something here. It would seem to me that the natural deduction would be that were it not for that prohibition, that's the way they would have taken, because that would be the shortest way into the land.
But they were supposed to go to the mountain first. That's the thing that
that doesn't make sense.
Exodus 13:17 doesn't tell them where to go. I mean, yes, in principally it does, but at this point it's just simply saying, don't go, you may not use that road.
Yeah.
All right, that suggests to me that they're going to be following a regular road and not some novel creation. They're not going to try to outwit the Pharaoh, try to wind all over the place and try to outwit the guy and get out, under false pretenses.
Those taking the Hebrew approach for the geography agree that the biblical text not only implies that God told them not to go by the way of the northern road, it explicitly says they didn't go that way. They also emphasize the initial destination of the journey.
Where are they going? Well, they're going to Mount Sinai, and that has to be brought into this too. They're going to Mount Sinai because early on, when God introduced himself to Moses at the burning bush, the sign that God was truly behind all this was that the people will worship me at this mountain. That's their destination.
However, even this point is disputed. Many in the Egyptian approach emphasized the ultimate goal of the Exodus journey, which was the Promised Land, and de-emphasized the initial destination of Mount Sinai.
They were forced north.
Egyptologist David Rohl favors a crossing at the northern Bala Lakes, along the northern road known by the Egyptians as the Way of Horus.
But one thing I want to bring up is that it says that they weren't supposed to go north. It says they weren't supposed to go the way of the Philistines, which is along the Mediterranean.
That's right.
So how do you explain that?
Well, they don't start off that way, do they? They go from the city of Avaris or Ramses in Goshen. The way of the Philistines is in this direction over here, but they don't go. They go across the Midbar Yam Suf over here because Moses is intending to take them on this road we call the Way of Shur, which goes to the Promised Land. That was his original intention.
They're heading over to Midian, right?
No, Midian's right down here. You can't tell me that. The Way of Shur goes to Beersheba, which is up here, and then on to Hebron. And it's used by the patriarchs. Abraham used that route. When Joseph brought the body of Jacob, he took him along the Way of Shur to Hebron, where he was buried in Machpelah Cave. So we know where that route is. That would have been the route that Moses would have planned to take them on. And of course, God tells him to turn back. And he turns them back in order to take them into the danger zone because he wants to perform the miracle of destroying the army. That's the whole point of it.
At the Red Sea?
Yeah. No. At the Yam Suf.
At the Yam Suf.
Biblical researcher Jodel Onstadt takes a Hebrew approach.
I know that they're trying to basically say, well, they left from Ramses, from the area of Goshen, and they went to Sukkoth, and then they turned and they got stuck up there in this area where the canals are. So you don't see much support of that from a biblical narrative?
No, if you look at the northern part of the Sinai is very, very sandy. Geologically it's called like sand dunes. And so it's very hard to walk with a caravan of people through sand dunes. Richard Friedman, in one of his recent books on the Exodus, talks about how a Jeep from the 1967 war is today something like under 30 feet of sand. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's very hard to walk. And then if you have carts, as what the Exodus account says, it's really hard to push or pull a cart. So it would have been very, very hampered.
You're talking about in that northern part of Egypt?
Quadrant.
In that Wadi Tumilat area? Or, I mean, up in that, not the Wadi Tumilat, but north of that?
Even north of that, as you go closer to what would have been geographically that Way of the Philistines or Way of Horus, or even if you would have gone under that, as people will often, scholars will say, if they're going to say Har Karkum, in that direction, it makes for a very arduous travel.
The biblical clues for the route and circumstances of the Exodus are the following. The Hebrews were well organized. They were unarmed at the departure from Egypt, and the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire showed the way. And the Hebrews, they walked day and night. It is stated that they were in the wilderness, and that's important. We don't talk about the desert like the Sahara Desert. We talk about going on very solid ground, gravel-like ground that was very solid to walk on or to drive on today, or similar to a street actually. Very solid ground. The direction from Egypt was not towards the north. That's very clearly stated. And since they were crossing the wilderness of the Red Sea, we know that they went in a kind of eastern direction, but not northeast. And we know also that they crossed or walked through the wilderness of the Red Sea. It means the land that was surrounded by the Red Sea, the two arms of the Red Sea. We also know from the text that they crossed the Egyptian border the same day. The same day they started their journey, they crossed the border.
However, those using the Egyptian approach believe the strength of the Egyptian place name interpretations mandates a crossing at the lakes of Egypt's border.
After the Bible tells us that they didn't go out this way, we're told instead they head in the direction of Sukkot. That's in both in Exodus 12:37 and also in Numbers chapter 33, where we have a place-by-place campsite itinerary. So you can see that they're heading towards the other way out of Egypt. There were two ways in and out of Egypt, one on the coast and the other following this route out into central Sinai. So it looks like that's the direction they were heading, towards what the Bible calls Sukkot. I should just add that this area was known in ancient Egypt as Cheku. Cheku linguistically corresponds to Hebrew Sukkot. And so it seems that they're clearly moving in this direction, at least initially trying to avoid this area. They come to this area and they're on the edge of the wilderness. They're about to leave Egypt. Exodus 13:20 tells us, and then suddenly they make a turn. Exodus 14:1 and 2 indicates a turn, and the word shuv means to turn back. Did they turn to more to the east or a little bit more to the west? But clearly they're heading back to the very area they were originally trying to avoid. What's puzzling is why they would originally avoid this route and now apparently head back up to it. But it doesn't make sense to me, but it does make sense in terms of following the geography of the text, and that much I'm stuck with.
So the people of Israel set out from Ramses and camped at Sukkot. And they set out from Sukkot and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness.
But then when they leave, they go from Ramesses to Sukkot. Sukkot is in the middle of the Goshen. It's in the middle of the Wadi Tumilat, and we know about Sukkot. And it's known in the Ramessid era. So, in other words, those places are all attested in what I would call contemporary Egyptian literature.
They cross this area and they come to a site we call today Tel El Maskuta, which is ancient Sukkoth of the Bible, or Sukkot. So Mas Sukkot and Sukkot would be the same place. Everybody agrees on that. This is the place in the Wadi Tumilat, the first camping site.
And this connected up with a road to Canaan called the Way of Shur. So this is quite clearly the direction they are moving to try to get out of Egypt.
Now, they were supposed to go on the way of the wilderness to Yam Suf. Is that similar to the Way of Shur?
Well, it's very difficult. What I'm trying to do is provide to look at all the geographical names we have and see where they land. I mean, if this is Yam Suf, all of this area here, and maybe even these whole lakes, this whole lake chain of lakes, then we could say that that's another way of we know from Exodus 12:37 and also from the book of Numbers, where we have the itinerary of Moses, that they began at the site called Ramses, now universally accepted to be the site of Kantir, here in the northeastern delta. And from there, we're told they headed towards Sukkot, which is to the southeast. And the reason we can say that is that we have along this stretch of green land this area known in Egypt as Cheku. Cheku is this linear green line heading out towards Sinai. That word Cheku in Egyptian is the word Sukkot in Hebrew. Linguistically, it matches. And the reason we know this is the case is there is a site located just about where that arrow is, and that site today in Arabic is called Tel El Maskuta. The Arabic Maskuta preserves the word Sukkot. So this happens where often the ancient name survives into the Arabic present-day name. So you have Sukkot and Maskuta, which tells us they're moving in the southeasterly direction, and they're heading the other way out of Egypt, namely what the Bible calls towards the way of Shur.
The Wadi Tumilat is very old.
However, there is a question of whether all these sites even existed at the time of the Exodus.
And I mean, a Canadian expedition, and also Donald Redford thinks it's Tel El Maskuta, but Tel El Maskuta was only built from the late 26th dynasty onwards, when Pharaoh Necho constructed his canal to the Gulf of Suez. So it didn't exist in Ramesside time, so you can dispense with this.
In his book, Ancient Israel in Sinai, James Hoffmeyer writes that the name Sukkoth just means a camp, and the site likely got its name because Semites had been camping there for centuries. But if the name Sukkoth just means a temporary encampment, couldn't it apply to just about anywhere that was stopped at by the Israelites? The first campsite, where do you place that?
So, Tim, my first stop is Sukkoth, and it's located about halfway between the exit point, which would be Tel Daba at Goshen,
Way up in there, yeah.
all the way down to the Straits of Tiran. But right in here, there's an area where the topography is a little bit difficult for foot, but quite passable, but very difficult for chariots. And so I thought, well, the theological workbook of the Old Testament calls Sukkoth the place where stop the approach is how they translate it. Now, I understand it's also booths and tabernacles. I understand that. But why would this be the stop the approach stop? And down here, there's this beautiful, flat, easy access. Up here, they create a buffer zone so that if the Egyptians were coming, it provided a bit of security, and that's why I placed it down on this large area. This is like 18, 20 kilometers wide.
Yeah, it'd be a big campsite.
It's big. And you know, there's 3.5 million Hebrews that are making this migration. Mm-hmm. In 2016, Doug Petrovich, a friend of mine, he published a book called Hebrew, the World's Oldest Alphabet. Now, I got that book, I read it, I loved it, I rejoiced it. I think it's a landmark book. And what he did was he took 15 inscriptions that were called the Sinai inscriptions, and he looked at them and said, well, maybe these are Hebrew. And he translated these as Hebrew inscriptions. 9 of these inscriptions come from Wadi Nasb and Serebet el Kadim. Now, the point is that are they Hebrew inscriptions or not? It doesn't actually matter. What does matter is it's very likely during the time of the oppression that there would be Hebrew slaves here. And so as Moses is coming down, he's going to stop, send a messenger over, and say, come join us. That may be why Sukkoth is located here. Now, I had this here before Doug published his book, and it just happened to maybe be a fortunate placement. But I believe personally, after he published his book, I thought, well, maybe that's why there'd be a large number of Hebrews that could join him.
Mm-hmm. The first campsite that the Israelites stopped at, Sukkoth, would that have been in Egypt, do you think?
It could have been. It could have been certainly on the outskirts of Egypt. But to me, the question is immaterial because they were allowed to leave. The Pharaoh said to go ahead and leave. And they took with them the jewelry and gifts from the other Egyptians, and they left without any sort of military resistance. And people say, well, they had to avoid these forts along the border of Egypt. That doesn't mesh because Pharaoh let them go.
What happens next, of course, is that in chapter 13 and verse 20, we're told that they are on the edge of the wilderness. They're about to leave Egypt. And by the way, they're at a place called Etam. And Etam, the Tam part of Etam, may well reflect the name of the god Atum. Atum is the name of the deity whose name is preserved in the Arabic name for this area today is Wadi Tumilat, the god Atum, the sun god. So it could well be that they're on the very edge of this Wadi Tumilat, Etam, and at this point, Exodus 14:2 says the instructions to Moses was, okay, turn back towards these new coordinates I'm giving you, Pi HaCherot, Migdol, and the sea. And of course, that, much to our chagrin, leads us right up to the very area where they were originally avoiding. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's where these places are. And so I'm compelled to go where the geography leads me, not where I'd like to see them go.
In this scenario, the Israelites would have traveled about 27 miles to their first campsite, but only about 7 miles to the second site of Etham.
Now, Etham is not a very long distance away. It's just over here. This place is called the Plateau Giza, and it's a higher area, slightly higher than the rest of the region. And it's a crossing point for the way of Shur, the route that goes all the way to Beersheba and Hebron. This is the place where they have to turn back. This is the place where Moses is told to turn back by God. And in fact, if you think about it, if Etham is the word for Egyptian Hetem, which is the word for border fortress, there would have been a big garrison of Egyptians sitting there.
In the Egyptian approach, all these events leading to the sea parting seem to be taking place in a very small area. Was this the desert wilderness the Israelites really crossed? Or did they cross a much larger wilderness? There's a big difference between these two options. Where would you put the second camp on the edge of the wilderness?
Only one that fits perfectly where they're genuinely trapped. They came over here, they stopped at Etham, they came to a dead end. Why? Because there's a series of mountains that go all the way over here, and it's impassable. You cannot walk through here. The water comes straight down in a sharp angle. They're really trapped hard here. And Pharaoh realized this geography, that he could come down, if he could just get to right up here at Succoth.
Get up here?
He's got them. He figures he's got them trapped. So he comes down with his 600 chariots, and they would stop right about here. Now the key is that it was at Etham where it triggered the idea that they were aimlessly wandering.
Why I would pick this area for Edom.
Glenn Fritz has a different edge of the wilderness for his location of Etham.
And then the wilderness of Edom would be the backdrop of that containing the rough wilderness. So it's an expansion of just the idea of Edom. And Edom was just a general term for the shore of the sea. And Moses used very general geographical descriptions. Large areas of terrain, large landscapes were used and given a simple name. And so when he uses the word Edom, it's a general term. We're on the shore of the sea. Well, we'd say, my goodness, he's 20 miles inland from the sea. But in his reckoning and his way of writing about the geography, with very few other landmarks to select or mention, he's on the shore of the sea here with this encampment. Well, looking at this historically, in Coptic Egyptian, the word Edom appears, similar spelling and pronunciation, and it means the boundary of the sea. Very simple definition.
And this is saying Atu?
Edom.
Edom.
Yeah, this is a U would be essentially the Greek mu character.
Okay.
So you're seeing the M on the end, but it's represented by a U because the Coptic alphabet is different than our alphabet. In the Arabic, Et-Tihama or Tama is the coastal zone of the Red Sea in northwest Arabia. And Tama or Tahama is translated as land sloping toward the sea. Burton wrote this in 1879 from his travels in Midian. What we understand from these uses is that Edom referred to the littoral, the shoreline of the Gulf. And so it could exist on both sides of the Gulf because it was the shoreline. It was the terrain sloping toward the sea.
One of the difficulties that you see with having a crossing over at this location here, what challenges would there be to the story?
My major objection is that we're told in Numbers 33 that Moses recorded the campsites stage by stage. And in Numbers 33 and in Exodus 12 and following, we find out that they go from Ramesses to Sukkot and Etam, and they haven't left Egypt yet. They're on the edge of the wilderness, and then they make this turn and cross the sea. If they make a turn some other way and are traveling across this 160 miles and doing that to the next campsite, which is down here, is very hard to explain. If we take the itinerary seriously, that this is a campsite by campsite record, as Numbers 33 presents it, then it's very hard to explain how they go all that distance to get to this crossing point. That's the major thing for me.
My understanding was that it didn't actually say how many days it took before they got to the crossing.
That's correct. But I'm working from the assumption that the recordings of the campsites, that they are all recorded, and we have, I'm assuming that they have a sequence in mind. This would have to require, my guess is somewhere about 8 more days of travel at about a 20-mile-day clip, which seems to be the average day's journey in the ancient world. There's no room between the end of Exodus 13 and the beginning of Exodus 14 for that 8-day trip. That's my problem.
Of course, those in the Hebrew approach would dispute the assumption that at the first 2 campsites, the Israelites were still in Egypt.
So the people of Israel were here at the border. We know that from the biblical text. They were just waiting for the order to cross the border and to go out into the desert or the wilderness. They had permission to walk out in the desert for 3 days to worship God. So we have the order that arrives to the people of Israel, and within the same day, or within 1 day, it says that they crossed the border. This is an important piece of information because it means that they went in one certain direction. They were close to the eastern border and they went across that border. The biblical text is also very clear that they did not go towards the north, and they did not go in any other direction either. They crossed the border here, they entered into this trade route, and then they went in this direction, following the road.
لا تنسوا الاعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.